They called it the Flying Fortress, a name that would one day echo through the clouds of Europe, a symbol of defiance, courage, and the boundless ingenuity of human engineering. But what most people don't know is that this legendary aircraft, the Boeing B-17, almost never made it into the skies at all. Its path from blueprint to battlefield wasn't one of glory and triumph. It was one of failure, secrecy, and an unshakable belief that the future of air power would belong not to the fastest or the flashiest, but to the most resilient. This is the untold story of how the B-17 Flying Fortress evolved from a rejected prototype into one of the most iconic aircraft in human history. In the mid-1930s, the world was holding its breath. The Great Depression had crippled economies, and the shadows of militarization in Europe were beginning to stretch long across the Atlantic. In the United States, military budgets were tight, and public sentiment leaned heavily toward isolationism. Yet, inside a hangar at Boeing's Plant 1 in Seattle, a handful of engineers dared to dream differently. They envisioned an aircraft that could do something no bomber had ever done before: fly higher, farther, and faster than any enemy defense could reach. The concept was radical. Instead of a small crew and short range, this bomber would carry a dozen men, defend itself with multiple machine guns, and travel thousands of miles without escort. It was a bold answer to the Army Air Corps' 1934 request for a multi-engine bomber capable of defending the coasts. Led by engineer E. Gifford Emery and Boeing's visionary designer, Edward Curtis Wells, the team began work on what they called Model 299. It was sleek, modern, and ahead of its time, a four-engine giant in an era when most bombers flew with only two. When the prototype rolled out on a summer morning in July 1935, reporters gasped. One journalist from the Seattle Times looked at its bristling gun turrets and exclaimed, "It's a flying fortress!" And just like that, a legend was born. But fate can be cruel to ambition. During the Army's official evaluation flight, tragedy struck. The prototype, Model 299, crashed on takeoff, killing two of the test crew. The cause? A simple but devastating oversight. The flight controls had been locked before takeoff. The Army immediately disqualified Boeing from the competition. The contract and millions of dollars in funding went to Douglas and Martin instead. It could have ended there. Boeing's Flying Fortress could have been just another forgotten prototype. But deep within the Air Corps, a few officers couldn't forget what they'd seen. They were convinced that this aircraft represented the future of air warfare. Quietly, they found a loophole. Using what little discretionary funding they had, they ordered a small batch of 13 YB-17s for testing purposes. Those 13 planes would become the foundation of everything that followed. By 1938, the world was changing fast. In Europe, war clouds were no longer a warning, they were a promise. Germany's Luftwaffe was expanding, and American military planners began to realize they might soon need the kind of reach only the B-17 could provide. The new model, the B-17B, introduced improvements: a stronger airframe, better engines, and more reliable turrets. It was still experimental, but word was spreading among pilots. The Fortress wasn't just tough, it was forgiving. Crews began to tell stories of limping back to base with engines destroyed, fuselages shredded, and still managing to land. It wasn't just a plane anymore. It was a symbol of hope. Then came 1941. When the United States was drawn into the war, the B-17 was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. In England, groups of young American airmen arrived to join the 8th Air Force. Many had never been overseas, never seen combat, never flown under fire. And yet they climbed into these massive bombers, the Flying Fortresses, and took off toward the heart of occupied Europe. Their mission was daunting: daylight precision bombing. The idea was that if the US could cripple factories, railways, and oil refineries, the Nazi war machine would grind to a halt. But it meant flying straight into heavily defended skies in broad daylight at 30,000 feet, where German flak and fighters waited in swarms. The early missions were brutal. The losses were heavy. And yet the crews kept flying, not because they wanted glory, but because they believed in the mission, in each other, and in the fortress that carried them home. The engineers back home took note. They began improving the design after every report, every mission. The B-17C became the D, then the E, the F, and finally the B-17G, the definitive version. Each variant added armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and most famously, the powered chin turret that gave the aircraft its distinctive look. Inside, the B-17 became a marvel of teamwork. 10 men, each with a role: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, and gunners spread across the nose, waist, and tail. Every position depended on the others. Every life was connected by intercom lines and faith. It was loud, freezing, and terrifying. At high altitude, the temperature could drop below -40 degrees. Oxygen masks iced over. Frostbite was common. And yet, despite all of it, crews often described something unexpected: a sense of purpose. The fortress wasn't designed for comfort, but for survival. And somehow, it gave them both. There were moments of quiet heroism that history rarely records: crews guiding crippled planes back to England with 2 engines gone, bombardiers steering the aircraft while the pilots were injured, tail gunners fending off attacks until their ammunition ran dry. And perhaps the most famous story of all, the encounter between a severely damaged B-17 and a German fighter pilot named Franz Stigler. When Stigler approached the wounded American plane, he saw the crew inside, some wounded, some tending to others, and instead of finishing them off, he saluted and escorted them out of German airspace. Years later, he would say, "I couldn't shoot. It would have been like shooting at a man in a parachute." That single act of humanity became one of the most powerful symbols of honor in an age of destruction. By the end of the war, over 12,000 B-17s had been built. They dropped more than 600,000 tons of bombs in Europe alone. But their greatest contribution wasn't destruction, it was endurance. They proved that an idea born in a small Seattle hangar could help shape the very strategy of the war. After 1945, the Flying Fortress continued to serve in rescue operations, mapping missions, and even early Cold War reconnaissance. Some were converted into passenger planes, others into firebombers, and a few, lovingly maintained by veterans and historians, still fly today. The sound of those 4 Wright Cyclone engines remains one of the most distinctive echoes of the 20th century, a sound that carries with it the memory of innovation, courage, and sacrifice. The secret of the B-17's evolution wasn't just in its design, it was in its people. The engineers who refused to give up after a crash, the mechanics who kept them flying, the young crews who trusted their fortress to bring them home. It was never meant to be a weapon of glory. It became instead a lesson in perseverance, that even when everything seems lost, resilience can take flight again. And so, when we look at the polished aluminum wings of a restored Flying Fortress today, gleaming under the sun, we're reminded of what it truly represents. Not just the past, but the human spirit's refusal to surrender. Because sometimes,
The greatest fortresses are not made of steel,